Hi, everyone. My name is Nicolas, and I'm going to talk to you about ConstraintLayout 2 with John.
Hi, my name is John. I work on motion layout.
All right, so we're going to talk to you about ConstraintLayout 2.1. So you might be familiar with ConstraintLayout. Oh. Sorry. Hold on.
Your next slide is not working.
Yeah, give me a second. All right. Okay, so let's talk about ConstraintLayout. A couple of features that you should know if you have been using ConstraintLayout 1.0. So basically, it's a very flexible layout manager that allows you to position elements relatively, control the dimensions, and we have those concepts about helpers objects so that you can create your layout, positioning them not only with those rules, but using those additional helpers objects. The other thing that we have as well is a very powerful design tools in Android Studio to control and define your UI. So here's a quick video on how you can, a little bit accelerated on how you can build a UI just using the design tools. The one thing I'd like to also mention as well that we often have this question is which layout are you supposed to be using, on Android? Like, are you only using constraint layout, or what are the other layout that you should be using? And I would simplify things like that. If you have a very simple situation that frame layout can address, or linear layout, you probably are fine using those. This is completely okay. You don't automatically have to only use constraint layout. So let me talk a little bit about what we bring in constraint layout 2. First, we added a lot of new properties and new capabilities in terms of layout. Specifically, we added the concept of virtual layout that brings, as helpers objects, additional capabilities to simplify your UI, right? We improved on the concept of helpers and the decorators. We added new programming API so that you can also control stuff directly in code as you need. And of course, and we'll talk, and John is going to cover that quite a bit, we brought motion layout, which is a subclass of constraint layouts that adds a lot of cool stuff in terms of animation. And similarly than with constraint layout with a layout editor, we also wrote a new motion editor in Studio. All right, so let me talk very briefly about those virtual layout concepts. So what is this? Well, it's essentially allows you to create like view groups, but in constraint layout. And why do we want to do that? The main advantage is that you keep things without adding a level of your hierarchy in your view group. And that way, we can just completely change the rules on the fly when we want, and that's going to be very handy for animation without having to replace the entire hierarchy. All right, so how does it look like? So essentially, this is just like a view that you add into your layout. And the key stuff here is that you reference other views. The interesting thing with the concept of helpers or virtual layout here is that multiple helpers can reference the same view, which is not something you do normally with a view group. So that can be very convenient to essentially attach different behaviors to the same views. The other thing you notice here is that I can add constraints because flow is just another view. So you can set a background, you can position that view, etc. So fundamentally, flow provides something akin to a linear layout, right? But it does that in a slightly different way, using the concept of constraint layout. Specifically, if you know about chains, under the hood, this is more or less what Flow does. We apply all those different chains so that the elements are positioned like that. So you could see it as a way of easily creating chains in your layout. So rather than having to manually define the constraints, put your elements into a flow, reference them, and you will have your chain. But it does more. It also have a mode to wrap elements. So if your objects don't fit in the available space, we can automatically wrap them. All right. So here's a quick example. The first mode is you're using a chain. So this, one second. So sorry about that. So you can basically have chains. So you have the normal chains where we can spread the elements around like that. You can also have spread inside. Again, those are the normal modes that you have in chains in constraint layout. You can also pack the elements like if they behave like a group. The other mode that we have is this wrap mode where you specify a chain, and if you have the amount of space available for it, that's okay. But if you don't, what happens? And essentially what happens here is that we automatically wrap your views so that they are not on the screen. And then we can specify the behavior of those elements that are wrapped. So you can choose between spread chain, pack chains. You can also specify how many elements you have maximum when you want to wrap something. And finally, you could look at it as, oh, doesn't that look a lot like a table? Not quite, right? If you have an element that is bigger, things are still going to behave like if they were multiple chains. So this is where we have wrap align that essentially make things like a table. So this is all a little bit abstract. So let me show you how it works in Android Studio. I have this layout with a bunch of elements that are not organized. One thing I want to show you as well that we added in 4.2 is this option to toggle the tools attributes. When you don't have constraints in Studio, we set up those attributes to those positions so that you don't automatically have to put the constraint, and you can still visualize your layout. And those tools attributes allows you to more easily see what happens when you run it on device. You can toggling them back and forth. So here, I went ahead and created my layout by selecting them, creating the helper, and as you saw, setting the constraints. I can then go into the panel and change some of the attributes. So we added a specific panels for it in 4.2 as well. And you can see here, I can simply reorganize the views so that they organize as I want. So let's go back to the horizontal mode. You see that the views are actually going outside of the screen, right? And I can just go here and set the wrap mode to change, and you'll see that the elements are going to be reflowed like that. I can use the align mode as well to be organized a little bit more like a table, and you have different alignment capabilities as well. And I can also set a maximum element to have the behavior that I want. All right. And that's for motion layout. John?
Yes. So one of the big things in 2.2 is motion layout. And we've been working on it for a long time. And it's very good at doing lots of animations and interactions. And you've probably heard about this by now. But first, let's talk a little bit about how it's sort of organized. At its core, it's a view group. And in fact, it is a subclass of constraint layout. And because it's a subclass, you get all of the features and attributes you see in constraint layout. So what does it actually do? it positions the views, it manages state, it controls some animation, and it does some comprehensive touch handling. Let's kind of break down how it does that. We start off by saying it will transition between states, and what it does is you have a start state and an end state, and you define a transition between those two states. Within the transition, you can have keyframes, and they can adjust the organization. And in fact, you can have many different states, and you can do a sort of state management associated with connected or not connected or whatever your application needs. And kind of how it's organized in your code is that you have your layout file like you've always had before, and you also have a motion scene file. And motion scene file will contain constraint sets that represent the different states, and it'll contain transitions. So you can say the layout file contains the base state. The motion layout, the states will position the constraints. It will affect the transforms on whether it's scaled or rotated. You can add custom properties, and there are some properties associated with motion you can add. Now, when you create a constraint set within the system, what you're doing is you're writing the XML that contains the information that was normally in your layout file, but it's actually now in your constraint set under constraint, and the IDs match up with the IDs of your layout file. A transition will tell whether you want to automatically handle clicking or swiping. It'll also give you your keyframes. And with keyframes, you can have multiple different kinds of keyframes. There's key positions, there's key attributes, triggers, key cycles, and in fact, there's a little graphing package that graphs the key cycles and the key attributes as they position. But let's talk a little bit about key position, because it's a unique. It's actually affecting the layout of the system. And it has actually 3 coordinate systems that it can work in. And you might wonder, why would you need 3 different coordinate systems? Well, since you're moving between 2 arbitrary configurations, and those configurations can change based on phone or on any kind of the text, the language size might adjust the layouts. You want to be able to define animations relative to the starting and ending position as it will occur on the device. The first one we have is parent relative. It's the simplest in some sense. It's essentially mapping to the screen coordinates of the layout, right? So that 0, 0 is the top left-hand corner, unlike this drawing. It's an old drawing. The next one is actually the most useful and the default one, which is delta relative. A delta relative provides you with a coordinate system where 0, 0 is the starting point of your layout, of your view, and 1, 1 is the ending point, and X and Y are kept separate. And this is a very powerful approach, and you'll see lots of uses of it in most applications. The next one that we have is actually parent path relative. And there we rotate the coordinate system such that the path is the x-axis. And the y-axis is perpendicular to the path. And again, the coordinate system is flipped in this picture. Now, a couple of little examples that kind of show some of the others. One of them is key cycle, and this is a very powerful tool for building weird oscillations and controlling lots of strange behaviors. And you'll see a little bit more of that in a little video I'll show later. Another one that is quite unique is key time cycles, which in fact, it oscillates in time, whereas the last one oscillates with the progress of your animation. And that's a subtle difference, but it's actually quite important, and you'll see more about it later. Now, let's go through a little bit of how you would make a motion layout. You start off with a constraint layout, you convert it to motion layout, and once you hit convert here, it will actually do the conversion and produce a user interface that is motion layout. And now you're in the motion editor. You have a start state, you have an end state, you have a transition. So the same XML concepts we talked about are there. And now you can go into start state and modify its locations. You can go to the end state and modify its location. And then once you go to the transition at that point, you'll be able to produce the animation, an animation. And you can actually play it directly in the motion editor. You can also scrub to any arbitrary position and press add a keyframe, and it can distort the position of an object. The other thing you can do is add the click or touch handlers. In this case, we'll add a click handler. So now it will automatically handle the clicks. And now we run it, and when you hit the click, you see the animation will work. So it's a fairly easy to sort of get going with the motion editor and get you something up and running pretty quickly, and very useful. So now, Nicolas.
All right, so so that's a lot of information, but that gives you a little bit of an overview of where we where we are in terms of the system, in terms of the capabilities. We actually just released. If my John, can you actually go next slide? I seem like I've lost the. Yeah. So we actually just released the 202. So if you want to use all of those capabilities in your project, you just need to add this dependency line, either the Android X one or the Android.support if you're still using that. We would recommend to use the Android X one. And would highly recommend for you to switch to the 202 because we added a lot of improvements in performances, notably, as well as several bug fixes. So if you have not done so, this is a really good release. The other thing that's important that I wanted to cover a little bit, it might be more important for us, but I think it does impact the project. And it's really the stuff we are doing on the infrastructure. So the first thing we are doing is we're actually moving the development on GitHub, fully in the open, all the code source is there. So you can actually go right now, sorry, on this address, and you'll find the current source code for 202. We are still in the process of moving all the development there, but the next versions essentially are going to be developed all there. The other thing is ConstraintLayout is actually separate between two libraries. There is a solver library that is more like a platform independent engine to do the layout, and you got the core library. You got the ConstraintLayout library, which is the Android library. So we are actually using that solver library also in other places like Compose. So we are renaming that solver into the core library, and a lot more of the capabilities will move toward there, so that we have we can actually use it as well in Compose. And specifically, that's related to motion layout. Going forward with 2.1, we will also drop the Android.support package name. So we will only release under the Android X package name, which I think by this point should not be too much of surprise. Next slide.
So I'd actually add one more thing about that. One of the cool things about being on GitHub is you can watch every single check-in I make when I build something. So you could actually see it being built live, which is kind of cool for those people hardcore wanting to see what we're actually building in the future. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about here is a little bit about how we would want to learn. How would you go about learning some more about this stuff? Because we could never teach you all the different things that are in a small talk. So one of the things we have is there are code labs, and you can actually use you can just go through a code lab, and there are even people online that have done it on YouTube. We have also a lot of advanced samples, which, and here's an example of this. This is the latest one. And you can see it's very sophisticated, and you could actually look at the code and see how they did it, which is kind of neat. The other thing that we have recently is the motion tag series, which is a series, and this is a sort of like a highlight reel from it. It's a series of 3-minute about short videos that for each tag within the motion layout system. So you can actually see how a particular, if you were interested in keyframes or key cycles, you could actually see how the key cycles work, or how does an on-swipe work, or how the control of a key cycle can achieve certain kinds of effects. So it's very, very useful. Actually, and a lot of all the animations you're seeing were being done with motion layout, and it talks about how to do them.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about 2.1. Next. And exactly what we want to do in that 2.1 release, right? So we've been working on 2.0 for a long time, and that we don't really want to repeat that kind of timeline for 2.1. So the goal mostly for 2.1 it's to go with something a much shorter release schedule, and we'd like to essentially be done by the end of this year. And so we're going to focus more on immediate features, immediate needs that we think are going to make still like a meaningful difference in your workflow. Next. So one of them, for example, is scalability. So specifically with motion scenes becoming larger, it becomes interesting to be able to split them up in different files, so that you can organize and reuse some of them in across different motion scenes. So we're going to support splitting them up like that. We also have this concept that's called the constraint overlay that essentially will allow you to define a constraint set just as an overlay of an existing constraint set. So the path that we took so far for constraint set is that a constraint set is in isolation describing the entire set of constraints. And we did that on purpose so that it's very clear as a developer what you get. The downside of this approach is that it can be a little verbose, because in some situations you end up having to redeclare things that you would have declared otherwise. So with the constraint overlay idea is that it's a little more okay, you can actually shoot yourself in the foot with the constraint overlay, because it's only going to declare rules that will add to the existing constraint that already exists. So for example, if I do a constraint on the left in my base constraint set, and in my overlay I do a constraint on the right, you are not going to be positioned on the right. You're going to be positioned in center, because left and right together means center. So while with the current approach, you won't get that. Like if you set a constraint on the right, it will all your element will be only on the right. But we figured that this flexibility is worth it. So it might be slightly less beginner friendly, but will actually also make things a lot clearer when you get at a more advanced level. So we'll keep those two approaches, but that goes into the approach we have with the system, where we want to build something that is great for beginners, but we also want the system to scale with as well as your knowledge of the system increase, so that you don't feel limited when you actually get a more advanced user. Another thing that we want to introduce in 2.1 is making layout width and layout height optional, because in some situations, specifically with the helpers object, like guidelines or barriers, they don't have an intrinsic size that you really have to specify. So you end up having to have the layout width and layout height specified for no good reason. So that's another example where we'll try to make the XML and the specification a little cleaner. And there's a couple more stuff like that we are thinking of, like for example with deriving the transition, so that you can, the same way that you can derive constraint set right now, say that a constraint set is essentially another constraint set with only a few modifications. We'd like to do that with transitions as well, and possibly explore more ways of organizing your work with includes and etc. Next.
So one of the big new areas in 2.1 that we're introducing here is much better support for rotation, essentially. And when you think of rotation, think of watch faces, think of sort of calendar pickers that rotate, all of that kind of stuff. But for this sequence, we will show a set of examples associated with just the sun and moon and earth, to kind of give you an idea. So from 1.1, we support constraints which are polar coordinates. You specify circle radius, circle angle, and you relate one object to the other. So in this case, you can say the Earth is at 45 degrees from the sun, and 80 dips away, and the moon is now that's a really nice way of specifying certain kinds of behaviors and certain kinds of positions, especially when you're thinking about like a watch. But there's been a problem in that if you want to animate that stuff, the animations would want to do a linear positioning of everything. So they'll interpolate them as straight lines, because that's what the basic motion layouts approach is. And what you want to be able to do is actually say, no, I want that to occur in polar coordinates. So what you have to do is define a constraint where you say animate relative to. And now the animations actually map to a polar coordinate type system where it's actually rotating in a way that makes much more sense in this particular context. And in fact, it's actually aware of your circle angle. And so you could specify a circle angle of 360, which in the normal interpolation does nothing, because it essentially doesn't move. But in this case, it realizes, oh, you want to orbit. And you see it's actually producing a very clean orbit around a moving object. And that could be taken, you can rotate around, you can have many, many angles, you can have angles, large numbers, and it all works. Now, one of the things that's cool about that is you can actually define key positions, and key positions, in fact, occur in polar coordinates. So in this particular case, I have shifted the X to make it, the Y, which is the angular change, to make most of the motion occur in the first half of the animation, or most of the time spent in the first quarter of the animation. Sorry, and in fact we can move in arbitrarily complex motion. So in this particular case, we see a rotation where the rocket is moving around in a circle, and then it leaves orbit and it goes into the goes to the moon. And now this is an extremely complicated animation. And if someone said, "Oh, build this," it would be like insanely complicated. But actually, with just a single key position placed in the right location, and you can sort of see it there as a little diamond, we can retard the motions and actually produce quite a simple animation. This is all, by the way, in 2.1. Other rotational support we're going to be generating is actually supporting touch handling in rotational coordinates, and also being able to set the pivot point of your transform. Now, which is sort of separate, because pivot points affect your transform layer, which not your layout layer. But it can be very useful for producing quick and easy effects like this. In this case here, I say I want to make the swipe a dragging of clockwise direction, and I want to have it rotate about the center of the Earth. In this case, the idea was Earth. And I say transform the pivot. So this would normally be done with a pivot X and a pivot Y, and you'll have to calculate where it is that you want the pivot point to be, and it's actually in the coordinate space of the view itself. So it's a lot of different things you'd have to figure out. This, it'll just say, oh, I want to pivot about this point, and it handles it. We also have a few other kind of miscellaneous things that are coming in, and I'll just show you one of them here. This is where you can quantize the motion. So think of, again, a watch where things are ticking. And in fact, you can actually use interpolators to interpolate the motion within that quantized section. So in this case, I'm using a bounce interpolator on the yellow plane, and it's no interpolator on the red plane.
So there's a couple of other things, yes, that we are thinking of for 2.1. One is animated text. When you try to animate text right now in motion layout with text view, you may have encountered like some issues, and a lot of that is kind of due to the way text view works. So we are thinking about introducing a much simpler animatable text widget. It's not going to be like a widget you would use to the extent you would use text view for long text and paragraph and stuff like that. But if what you want to do is animating like a title or something like that, which is like the majority of cases, then we can provide like a helper object that does that in a better way. Next. So the other thing that we have in 2.1 is another helper object called the carousel. So if you don't know what a carousel is, that's an example. So it's looks a bit like a recycler view essentially. But the big difference is that because it's within constraint layout and motion layout, you can easily transform and do like interesting transitions with it very easily. So next. So the general approach is very simple. Imagine that you got like those three views, in different colors. Next. And you want to scroll. This is essentially the motion that you see on screen. And the whole trick, next, is that we essentially move things around so that we still reuse those same views, but by simply moving them around correctly and updating them with the right stuff, then it will look like we have an infinite list. It's actually exactly the same trick as recycler view does, but we do that here within a constraint layout and motion layout. And you can do that simply by specifying the different states and just manipulating them. So while you can do that manually today, and a lot of people do, we simply will provide a helper object. So in that, once you set up your different object that you want to use in a carousel, you just have to add a carousel helper, specify the transition for forward and backward, possibly an initial state or the main central view that you want, to move to pivot around essentially, as well as the views that you are using in your carousel. So and essentially then that carousel objects will do the job to call you back so that you can fill the element a little bit like the recycler view callback. So why going through all the way instead of using recycler view? Well, the main advantage is as you are in motion layout, you can actually edit all of those things directly in Studio. So I show you here, and I can select different states. So here I have like a start state, a previous and next state. And you can see that if I go on the forward transition, I can show you how it actually changes like that. And I can just scrub it, see how it behaves. Same thing for the backward transition. You'll see that this is how it will work. Notice here that I don't actually specify anything in terms of if there is no element at the beginning or whatever, and that's the carousel object will actually automatically hide those elements for you. And you can see here with just selecting the play button that gives you already an idea of what it looks like. What's really nice though is because you have the motion editor, you can go and modify something like here, just a rotation, see it immediately live in Studio and see what it looks like without without having to even push it on the device. So you have a much faster iteration speed and also a much easier way to do really interesting carousel animation. So the goal here is not to replace recycler view. If you have a really long list of items with like thousands and thousands of items, recycler view is optimized to do that. So that's really what you should do. But if you want a really fancy carousel effect with things rotating, scaling, or whatever your designer wants to do, then a carousel is going to be a nice pattern in your toolbox. Let's recap a little bit and beyond 2.1, yes, I need to cover that very quickly because we are running out of time. Next. So obviously the big question is about compose. What are we going to do for compose? Well, one thing to keep in mind for both constraint layout and motion layout is that what we are trying to provide here is a set of concepts that you can use in your in your day-to-day programming life, right? Like the concept to lay out your elements, concept to specify a motion declaratively, and we are bringing all of that to Compose as well. So in fact, you can already use constraint layout in Compose, and we are in the process of actually bringing motion layout in Compose. This is what I hinted earlier about the core library and etc. So you'll be able to use the same concept in Compose. In some situations, you might also want to use what Compose directly provides in the simpler cases, but essentially for the more complex cases, constraint layout and motion layout and the tooling will be there to help you. So here's a quick example on how it looks like right now in Compose. You can set up a constraint set with your list of constraints and pass it to a constraint layout. So that's one way of specifying the constraints. Next. And you can see you can also declare the constraint set inline as a parameter, but the nice thing is that you can declare a constraint set as a separate variable. So it's kind of up to you. We have also a different way of writing those constraints, and that's completely inline. So essentially here we synthesize the constraint set on the fly. So it looks a little more like what you would have done in XML. The disadvantage that then you cannot swap constraint sets depending on what you want to do. So we're still working on it, still iterating on it, and feedback very welcome on Compose, obviously. So a quick recap on everything. Next. So basically, constraint layout, we're trying to build up something from a simple model, but with powerful behaviors that you can reuse. We have this design tools integration in Android Studio, which is pretty important so that you have all those tools to help you create your layouts. You can use linear layout, that's fine. We're not going to shout at you. Also, if you want interesting group behaviors with wrap content and with automatic wrap for your elements, Flow is really handy. And for motion layout, John?
Motion layout, it essentially is about making animations easy. It really actually is very, very powerful at making you to build stuff that is quite simple and very easy to maintain and manage and support in the long term with good separation between the animation and the UI elements. It's really good at making the modifying the animations, and it's really about making animation sustainable. You can actually see a lot of cases where animations have to get abandoned because it's too difficult to migrate the animation to the next version with lots of with a small change in the UI. Now someone has to recalculate a whole bunch of animation effects. You'll find it actually very easy to do that here.
All right, finally, here's a quick slide with some documents and some links, so take a peek. And next thing I would say, give us feedback. We have the issue tracker. We'll probably move to the GitHub issue tracker in the course of 2.1, but for now, don't hesitate to file bugs or feature requests on the Google issue tracker. And that concludes our talk. Thank you very much.
You can find us on Twitter, and that's actually one of the best places to reach out to us. And we're always active on Twitter in terms of communicating. Okay?
Yeah, don't hesitate. Thanks.